What was it like to be a woman on the 2016 campaign trail? Two very different women, two very different books. We're going to talk with Jill Abramson, a former executive editor of the New York Times, about Hillary Rodham Clinton's new book, What Happened, and Katy Tur's new campaign memoir, Unbelievable.
She knows that he is a creature of media attention. You know, he was a reality TV star. But this is an indication that he's monitoring every word.
Alexander Alter will give us an update from the literary world. Plus, we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. This is Inside the New York Times Book Review. I'm Pamela Paul. Jill Abramson joins us now from Cambridge. She is, of course, a former executive editor of The Times and currently is a political columnist for The Guardian and a senior lecturer at Harvard. This week, she reviews Katy Tur's new campaign memoir, Unbelievable, My Front Row Seat to the Craziest Campaign in American History. Jill, thank you for being here.
I'm thrilled to be with you.
And I'm also excited. We're going to talk not only about this book, but also about its kind of natural companion, Hillary Clinton's new memoir, What Happened. The Hillary book is actually number 1 on Amazon right now, and Katy Tur's book is number 2.
Number 2, yeah.
And I want to read...
I also discovered something I thought was really interesting about the two of them because I had to write about the Clinton book for The Guardian and, of course, had the honor of writing about the Tur book for you. But in doing background research on both of them, you know, Wikipedia comes up first in Google, and they have the same birthday.
Oh, really?
26.
Interesting.
So it's like kismet that the two books be paired and be number 1 and number 2.
I mean, also, I have to find even like greater meaning in that. I mean, it's interesting. These two campaign books by two women about Trump and about the 2016 election, and two women who were sort of dismissed. I mean, one of the interesting things is people sort of wondered, well, who wants to hear from Hillary Clinton about sort of her version? Clearly, a lot of people do.
People were glued to this election, whether it was because it seemed like a terrible car accident that you couldn't look away from, or because of genuine fascination with the topsy-turvy politics of 2016. So because she was the focal point of so much of that attention and coverage, I think people are naturally interested in what did it feel from her vantage point? And that's what you get in her book.
So I want to talk about each book individually, but before we do that, you also covered this campaign. Reading these two books, what did you learn about the campaign that you sort of didn't know already as someone who followed it closely?
What I learned from Katy Tur's book is more about Trump supporters and the people who came to his rallies, and when he would target the press and call them the fake news media or later the enemies of the people. She became very interested in who are these people, and her conclusion, I thought, is interesting. After going to rally after rally, she covered the Trump campaign from the first minute, so she really went to so many of his events. And her takeaway was, you know, these people are your neighbors. They're the people in the grocery store line. They're the people you may see at church. They're normal, well-behaved people who somehow, like at these rallies, became a vicious mob. And that transformation fascinates her, and it's fascinating to read about in her book.
And what about in Hillary's book?
Katy Tur's book, in an odd way, is more visceral. Hillary Clinton's book is more of, it's her own autopsy of her campaign. And, you know, she will describe feeling hurt and distraught at moments, but it's told a little bit, at a little bit more of a distance, oddly.
Okay, let's talk first about Katy Tur. Who is Katy Tur? How did she get into covering the Trump campaign?
the way she got into covering the campaign was not because she desired to cover the campaign. She had a foreign assignment in London, which is, of course, for a young, relatively experienced NBC News correspondent, a plum assignment. She had, a boyfriend who she was very involved with at the time. So she had no desire to move, but she was making a home visit to NBC in New York, and one of her bosses said to her, "How would you like to cover the 2016 campaign?" And she knew that this would be a good career step, so her ears pricked up, and then she found out the assignment was Donald Trump, which, of course, way back before the primaries began, was a dud of an assignment because
Right.
nobody thought he was going to be the nominee, and the likelihood was going to be, she'd be doing it a couple of months, and then he'd be out, and she'd go back to London. Of course, that isn't what happened.
I thought that's one of the things that her book really got out well was, putting you back at that moment where the low expectations of that moment, which of course seems like forever ago, and also all of the firsts, the sort of the first time he singled out Muslims, the first time he singled out the press, on the campaign trail, sort of making it newly shocking again.
She is struck right away at the, horrible, hateful things that Trump is saying. So extreme, so, blatantly racist and demagogic. And, she recognizes that this is anomalous for American politics. Only, the fringe candidates like George Wallace in 1968 and 72, veered into these kinds of extreme proposals. And people are, both horrified and fascinated by Trump, which is something that Tur recognizes very quickly. And if anything, it works to her benefit because there is this fascination with his candidacy, and it turns out, of course, that Trump is ratings bait as well as clickbait. So the assignment that was going to be a dud turns out to be one that, the network has interest in. CNN is very soon, really starting around Iowa and New Hampshire, covering some of Trump's events live. And Tur has the benefit of being on the scene at those events as the only network correspondent for NBC.
And so for those listeners who were not watching all of this play out on NBC, what happened between Katy Tur and Donald Trump?
Well, almost from the get-go, he singles her out as the embodiment of the evil media, the evil, unfair news media. And what sets him off against her is just she tells the truth in one of her early stories that there were protesters at one of his rallies and that a protester had to be taken off the stage. And she actually doesn't even say that on the air, but she tweets about it. And of course, 2016 was the Twitter campaign. So she tweets about it, and then he takes off after her immediately after she tweets, which is very telling to her because she knows that he is a creature of media attention. He was a reality TV star, but this is an indication that he's monitoring every word that reporters are writing or saying about him, even their Twitter feeds. But that one tweet about the protester is what gets his goat. And for the rest of the campaign, little Katy, as he calls her, which is just so obnoxious, becomes really his prime media target.
One of the things I thought was interesting in her book was that she described sitting down for this interview with Donald Trump, and she thought it went well. And it was only afterwards, in seeing it on camera, that she realized how angry he was, and that it didn't feel the same in person as it had on camera. And I wonder if that there's kind of a larger point there about the way in which Donald Trump sort of comes across in person versus on screen, and if that affected the sort of campaign and the coverage.
Well, I think that phenomenon worked to Donald Trump's benefit. I think from being on The Apprentice, 20 seasons of that show, he learned, whether he was acting or it was how he genuinely felt on camera, but he learned, that he learned exactly how anything he said or his mannerisms or tone of voice came across to the television audience. And no politician, I think, has been more skillful at modulating exactly how he wants to be perceived by the audience.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think what Tur is noticing in watching her own interview is actually the master of the craft of being on television at work, because why would he have any interest in coming across? He's interested in motivating his base during the primaries of very, very conservative voters. So it behooves him to come off in a network interview as somewhat hostile, if not extremely so. So he's playing to his audience, and she's just conducting an interview with a presidential candidate and trying to do it as professionally and as thoroughly as she can. But his ambition for that interview is entirely different.
In terms of the reporters that Donald Trump criticized on the campaign trail, it does seem like they were predominantly women, or at least that criticism was leveled at women in a different way than it was at men. How much?
Yeah, it definitely was. And it is typical of sexist treatment of women in any workplace situation, which is that the criticisms and comments become very personal and, involve their looks. And, everyone was shocked when Trump, in one of the early debates, talks about Carly Fiorina's face
Mm-hmm.
and how ugly she is, basically. And that, he was very horribly mean to candidates like Jeb Bush, but, his criticisms of them were he's low energy.
Right. It wasn't about their physical appearance.
But all of the criticisms of the women correspondents were very personal, like taking it. What's interesting is many of the correspondents, both men and women, who he attacks are reporters and journalists that he actually talks to a lot on the phone, or even goes to meals with and actually enjoys their company, and certainly likes to hear their observations about the campaign. But and someone like Maureen Dowd fits that description. I mean, I think Trump, in reality, actually likes her and respects her, but I'm forgetting the word he uses for her, but, he kind of, his word in attacking her on Twitter was akin to nutty
Mm-hmm.
or flighty or something like that.
Well, I mean, there's almost something sort of
dismissive.
creepily flirtatious about this kind of love-hate relationship that he had with women journalists in particular.
Yeah, well, it's I think somewhat different with all of them. I don't think his relationship with Megyn Kelly involved much love.
No. But with Katy, he kissed her.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, which, is such a shock to her. And yeah, she has a wonderful description of that moment when he kisses her, where she, I think, writes that he is so close she could smell what he'd had for breakfast. Like, ew.
It's not exactly a courtship scene. I want to talk about the book itself because it's sort of a cross between a memoir, a traditional memoir of a limited scope, and a campaign book. It's like a campaign memoir. And I'm curious how it differs from other campaign books, whether about this particular campaign you mentioned Shattered earlier, and also about campaign books about previous campaigns, which you have written about for the book review.
Campaign books become bestsellers because a certain audience is very interested in the juicy details and gossip of what went on behind the scenes in the campaign, which top aides were jockeying for power with other aides to the candidate, who hated who, who was the real genius behind some of the moves in the campaign, all that sort of insider stuff. And Game Change, for instance, which was a huge success after the 2008 campaign, was full of that, and people just ate that up, and it actually, made a pretty good movie afterwards with Julianne Moore immortalizing Sarah Palin. That's one typical kind of campaign book where the authors who have covered the election take the reader by the hand and take them behind the curtain so that, you're seeing what was going on inside the campaign, not what you watched on TV with the candidate talking in various venues. So that's one classic kind of campaign book. And the other, which is the kind of campaign book that I personally prefer, is one that really tells you something about the country and voters and why things happened as they did, and also really explores the characters of the candidates themselves in ways that illuminate them and shed light on aspects of their lives and beliefs that a reader didn't know before. And that would be, Richard Ben Kramer's What It Takes, that just gives you almost a mini biography of all of the candidates beginning during the primaries. Or, Teddy White, certainly his first book, The Making of the President in 1960, where you had such a sea change in politics and a generational change from Dwight Eisenhower to JFK. He really brings the country itself and the changes in it alive in that book. So you learn something, I think, profound about why politics unfolds the way it does in a particular moment, as opposed to here's, all the gossipy details that happen behind the curtain. I'm not saying I don't have, a prurient interest in the latter.
Mm-hmm.
Read all those books, I do. But Katy Tur's book is neither one of those kinds of campaign books. And it isn't really, a full memoir either. She gives you some details about her growing up and her background. I mean, she had very interesting parents who were journalists, and they were sort of daring-do journalists who were the first actually to rent helicopters and, shoot footage of police car chases and that kind of thing. And they made a lot of money selling that video to, local TV stations in California, which is where she grew up. But her parents would literally take her up in these planes, and she would see her mother hanging out of the plane to film whatever, car scene they were chasing. And it actually made her think that journalism was the last thing that she wanted to do with her life. When she went to college in California, she intended to go into one of the secure professions like law or medicine, but obviously things didn't turn out that way.
I mean, it's interesting then to read these scenes in which her mother is texting her sort of, frantically saying, "Are you okay? Are you okay?" after Trump is attacking her at these rallies, that, this was no shrinking violet of a mother. She knew what journalism could be, and she was scared.
Yeah, at one point she actually, her first call that Tur describes in the book, her mother cries. Her mother says to her, "Do you have your own security?" Because, the mobs at these rallies, with Trump whipping them up into a furor and pointing to where the journalists are located in the audience at the rallies, they look like they are close to, wanting to throttle these correspondents. So, her mother is genuinely worried about her daughter. And in fact, at a rally during the South Carolina primary, which is fairly early on, the crowd is so menacing that Tur is doing her stand-up after a rally, and the people lurking around are looking so threatening that Trump's Secret Service ushers Tur and her cameraman out of the rally site.
I'm talking to Jill Abramson about Katy Tur's new book and Hillary Clinton's new book. We'll have to pause just for a moment to take a break. We'll be right back. It's interesting you're talking about the different kinds of campaign books that there are. And it seems like Katy Tur isn't pretending. She says up front that, this is one of the most bizarre campaigns in American history. It roiled America, and with it, my little life. I won't pretend to explain it. I will tell you what I saw. So she is sort of laying out the terms of what she's trying to do in the book there and kind of managing the expectations. Do you think she succeeds in telling that story?
I think she succeeds in conveying what the experience of living inside the Trump campaign for months and months, what that was like. And I think she does that well.
Let's talk about Hillary's book now. You said earlier that what bothered Donald Trump so much about Katy Tur was the fact that she was honest. And you just wrote this really great column for The Guardian, basically saying that Hillary Clinton is trustworthy. She is an honest person. Is that what bothered Trump in many ways about her?
Oh, I think that so many things about Hillary Clinton bothered Donald Trump. I think probably first and foremost is that she is a clearly brilliant woman who actually has experience at the highest levels of government and knows what the job of being president requires.
Yep.
And I think that very fact set him off and infuriated him. I think Hillary Clinton, oozed her contempt for Trump. And I'm sure that, drove him crazy as well.
And yet, people on the outside, or at least partisans, liberals, Democrats, Hillary Clinton supporters, felt that she didn't show her contempt enough, that she was sort of rather restrained on the campaign trail.
That is something that is very interesting and shattered. Your observation about her self-restraint and that it could have hurt her politically. Because how she's billed her book, what happened is that this is the unvarnished me. This is me letting loose and telling the real story of what happened. she describes all of these instances where she wants to do one thing and then restrains herself from doing it because of, thoughts about why it might not be the right thing to do or why she has a responsibility for this or that. And I'll give you some examples. I mean, the most famous one, of course, is when Trump, in one of the debates, was getting into her physical space, stalking her on the stage and sort of towering over her like Frankenstein. And she says that, what she was thinking is, back off, you creep, and that's what she wanted to say. But that restraint mechanism that she's learned over time made her just carry on and remain calm and carry on and even continue smiling. She admits, that probably was the wrong decision.
Right.
But if she learned from that, then what fascinates me is at the beginning of the book, for instance, she's writing about how devastated she is following her defeat. And the first thing she says is how much she didn't want to go to the inauguration. She really didn't want to go. Viscerally, she didn't want to go. And yet that dutiful side of her says, for the sake of democracy and the continuity of power, like Bill as a former president and I as a former first lady have to go. Then, a few weeks, there is the Women's March right after the election, and she's dying to go to the march, and yet that same voice inside her head says to her, no, don't go. It's time for other women to step on to center stage. And that restraint, that never trusting her gut, the fact that she never does anything impulsive, I think really hurts her. I think if she'd gone to the Women's March, I even think if she didn't show up in the inauguration, there's a certain element in the country that would have said, yay!
Right, good for you.
She's actually doing something authentic that, is her, is how she really feels. But I think it's almost an unconscious thing because, I bet she didn't realize as she's writing this book that is such a clear pattern over and over again.
And yet, what's interesting, you brought up that comment she made when he was looming over her and that her immediate thought was, what a creep. When that leaked...
Back off, you creep.
Yeah, back off, you creep. And yet, that part leaked out before the book came out. An audio clip was leaked. And the response on social media was, that's not the real Hillary Clinton. She wouldn't have used the word creep. She would have used a much harsher term. And you almost feel like she's kind of damned if she does, damned if she doesn't, no matter what she does.
I guess. I mean, I did not go on social media about the book, but I think creep is exactly the word she might have used. I mean, she is this Methodist good girl. And she, uses curse words from time to time and, I know has used them in episodes of anger. But I think back off, you creep is her. I wish she had said it. I think it really, would have helped her.
Yeah. I mean, because that seemed to be what resonated when you look at Katy Tur's book and you look at what the reaction of the crowds to Trump at those rallies, it was when he was that kind of unfiltered. It was that unfiltered.
Well, he's always unfiltered.
Yeah.
He doesn't have a filter. I mean, that's what I think in the end, my takeaway from reading these two books was that the most impulsive candidate in modern political history was running against the least impulsive, the candidate who just could never go with her gut.
So Hillary Clinton has written 3 major books now that you could consider memoirs. Her first, of course, Living History. The second was Hard Choices, and now What Happened. How does this book compare to those first 2?
Well, I have to admit, I did not read the book that she wrote, Hard Choice.
Nobody did.
It sounded really boring. It sounded like one of those books that people who love Hillary Clinton went out and bought and put on their coffee tables and never read. So didn't read that one. Did read her first one and really liked it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the things that I remember most about it is her writing about her mother's life and growing up, and what a hard growing up she had, and the influence that had on her. And I don't, May correct me if this is wrong. My memory of when she wrote that book was she wrote it right after leaving the White House.
Yeah, and what was interesting is that everyone focused on, how much is she going to talk about Monica, but she also did talk, as you said, very openly about her father and about her upbringing and this very Midwestern kind of, really, ironically,
right. She had a relationship with that, minister who has been in her life all along and who did, help get her through the Monica thing.
Yeah. And when you compare her, childhood with Trump's childhood, it's kind of ironic in terms of how they then characterized, or how he characterized her later on. One of the things that people have said about what happened is like, this book is different. This is a new Hillary. You're really seeing her.
I didn't think so. Because of that, what I just said to you, it's the Hillary that always is filtering everything. Mm-hmm. And that is the authentic Hillary, but that means you're never sure if in anything she writes or says you're getting what she really thinks inside her own head. We're just never going to know. So, I think it's foolish to say whether that it isn't that book or that it is that book. Very few people know the real Hillary Clinton.
But one thing that it sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds like in this book that, her anger does come through, and that in previous situations she's kind of controlled that a little bit more. And she's not only, of course, angry, she has many things to be angry about, from Bernie Sanders to James Comey to...
Oh, well, let's get started on the New York Times.
Well, I was going to say, let's talk about the anger towards the New York Times and her criticism. And can you describe that? What she says in the book?
What she says in the book is that the New York Times has had it in for her going back to the first Bill Clinton presidential campaign and the way that the paper blew up the Whitewater scandal, and that ever since then that the news pages of the Times have been stacked against her. She does allow for the fact that, the paper's editorial board has endorsed her in every race she's run. Mm-hmm. But she actually thinks that, the news editors were out to get her.
Okay. So as a former news editor at the New York Times, what did you think of that?
I think it's nonsense. And, I think that she, it turned out conventional wisdom was wrong, but she did win the popular vote by several million votes. And she seemed like the most likely person to be elected president. And so it was natural that she attracted an outsized amount of the investigative reporting that was done. And, various editors, including Dean Baquet, have said, that if they had it to do all over again, they probably would have done more on Trump. Mm-hmm. But it's just nonsense that the editors of the New York Times were stacked against her. And she said that about me when I was both managing editor and executive editor, that I individually, had it in for her and, didn't want her to win, which is ridiculous. I actually met Hillary and Bill Clinton in 1978.
Oh, wow.
I don't want to say I've known them as in, close, knowing them in a close way, but, over the years I've had, a considerable number of dealings with Hillary Clinton. And, the pattern of those dealings I've written about, that as long as I was approaching her for her own expertise and in the jobs that she held on her own, she was great and helpful and cooperative and illuminating. But whenever I dealt with her when she was First Lady, or certainly, during the various controversies that bedeviled her during her husband's 2 terms, she didn't want to talk or deal with me. I understood that. I got it. Mm-hmm. But the idea that I have admired her. I have always admired the work she's done on behalf of children and women, and had extensive dealings with her when she was head of the ABA's Commission on Women earlier in her career. So, she knew at some level that wasn't true. But, I think she was frankly looking for some rationale other than, the Clintons' own business dealings and acceptance of high speaking fees and the obvious potential for conflict of interest that existed in raising lots of money from foreign governments for their foundation, and her work as Secretary of State. She's just blind to the fact that those things are genuinely troubling and need to be investigated. So her explanation for why the Times devoted attention to those subjects is the paper was out to get me. It's ridiculous.
So let's talk about her other targets. So the Times criticism, you think, is without foundation. What about her anger towards Comey, towards Sanders?
I think her anger towards Jim Comey is justified. And, I think that especially, I was very troubled, during his first press conference when he announced there would be no charges in the email investigation. I thought that was horrible and against every protocol that I know about for how prosecutors behave when they don't bring charges. You don't do a public flailing when you have basically exonerated someone. So that hit me as something that she had every justification to complain about. And then when he announces the reopening of that investigation so close to Election Day, I was just completely shocked. I recognized right away that this was going to be a really tough problem for her because, it would revive all of the worry that voters had about whether she was honest.
So it instantly took you back to Whitewater.
To everything.
Mm-hmm.
The problem with Clinton, and we really should probably talk more about Trump and Katy's book, but the problem with the Clintons is that their own behavior and conduct does raise legitimate questions about their honesty and trustworthiness. Never to the point, I don't think either of them, other, than the president's illicit affair with Monica Lewinsky, have never, done anything that is wrong in the sense of being illegal. And I think, both of them are basically honest, and she in particular is trustworthy. I've written that, but, she knew more than anyone. She spoke when the Monica scandal erupted about the vast right-wing conspiracy.
Mm-hmm.
No one knows its workings and methods better than her. And she knew what she would face in terms of everything she did would be picked apart. And it struck me that she somehow was still ill-prepared for that.
Before we go into back to Katy Tur's book, and I want to talk about the two of them together, just a couple more questions. What surprised you most reading Hillary Clinton's new book?
That's a great question. Let me think about it. What surprised me is something she says at the very beginning of the book, which is, I ran for president because I thought I would be good at the job. I think that is a really honest answer for why she ran. And yet, she had been told by all of her pollsters that, running on her experience and her capability was not going to do the trick, that wasn't going to work. And so she was, she spent all this time concocting, a message of why she wanted to lead the country, why she wanted to be president, when that simple fact was the honest reason. And in Shattered, there's like this great vignette about how at Hillary Clinton's campaign headquarters at the beginning of the campaign, there's this wall of Post-it notes. And on top of the wall, it says, Hillary is for ... And then there are a zillion of these Post-it notes. And one of her supporters actually says, it's an anonymous quote, but, if you're for everything, you're for nothing. She writes in the book about her announcement speech at Roosevelt Island and, how moving and meaningful it was to her. But her speech, if you go back and listen to it, it could have been given by any Democratic candidate. It was, kind of mishmash of and I'm not saying that they're wrong proposals, but, there was nothing that really made it special to her. And that was a problem. But, I don't even know if she realized in writing it, that there it was at last, the honest answer to why she ran. And she gives voice to it at long last. And that kind of surprised me.
Was there anything, last question on Hillary's book, and then we'll turn back to Tour for just a few minutes, but was there anything in here where you thought, you know what, like, I just learned something about Hillary I didn't know, or something I thought about her turns out maybe to have been wrong?
It sounds mean, but no.
Well, you did meet her in 1978. Can you just tell us quickly, what were the circumstances that you met Bill and Hillary Clinton in 1978?
It was shortly. 1978 was just 2 years after I got out of college, and I had a fascination with Southern politics in the U.S. And out of the blue, I moved to South Carolina, and I put together kind of a mishmash of jobs. I wrote a political column for an alternative weekly newspaper in Columbia, South Carolina, but I also did some freelance writing for a political consulting firm located in South Carolina that specialized in progressive Democratic candidates in the mold of Jimmy Carter, who was president. And so one of the clients of this firm was Bill Clinton, who was making his first bid for governor of Arkansas. He was general. And, I met them because I went down to Little Rock to do some research, to write the scripts for his radio spots, things like that. And so, I met her because she was, in some ways, the unofficial campaign manager for the campaign.
And what was your impression of her back then?
My impression of her was that she was very guarded. I felt that she was not joyful that he was running for governor, but she was incredibly smart about politics and the tactics of politics.
I think I love that phrase, not joyful. That's like a very understated description. Just bringing it back to Katy Tur, looking at these two books together, obviously they're both women. I think that Hillary Clinton fundamentally or sort of more overtly points to sexism than Katy Tur. But how much of reading these two books, how much of you do you think the reaction that both Trump and Trump supporters had to these two women was sexism?
A ton in both cases. What's interesting about comparing them is, of course, Hillary Clinton is more than twice Katy Tur's age, and they're representatives of the very different kind of feminism, each of them. I mean, Hillary's first wave feminism, and Katy Tur, is second or third wave feminism, and that's very different. Katy Tur has, I think, an inner kind of gameness and confidence that is pretty striking, considering she's covering, the first national election of her career. She's a complete novice political correspondent, and yet she's like ready to get in there and, mix it up with Trump and really sort of stand up to his taunting of her. And, I don't think she's bedeviled by that kind of inner voice where she's questioning every move she makes and how it's going to appear. She's competing. She's competing to get on the air. She's competing in the general election with other, bigger names on the NBC News roster, like Andrea Mitchell for airtime. And, she's got a lot of confidence when she isn't picked to moderate one of the debates between Clinton and Trump. She marches in to the bosses at NBC News and tells them she's angry about that. She feels like she's the one who's been traipsing around the country since day one with Trump. She's the one that knows the most about him, and yet she's sidelined, and she doesn't hesitate to express that.
Yeah, it's interesting. She almost, in a kind of millennial way, maybe it's in part, as you said, not only a different generation in terms of feminism, but really just a different generation, has this kind of like bravado and toughness.
Yeah, she's always, yes, I can. And that I don't think there are that many first-generation feminists who innately have that kind of confidence.
Well, I have to tie this up. Clearly, they have the confidence, or should have the confidence now, of being major best-selling authors. Hillary, of course, already was. But as we said, Hillary Clinton's What Happened is #1 right now on Amazon. Too early for the New York Times bestseller list. And Katy Tur's Unbelievable is #2. Jill Abramson, thank you so much for this. I could talk to you forever about both books.
It's a really interesting conversation.
Jill is, of course, a former executive editor of the New York Times, and she is currently a columnist for The Guardian and a senior lecturer at Harvard. This week, she reviews in the book review Katy Tur's Unbelievable, My Front Row Seat to the Craziest Campaign in American History. And for obvious reasons, we also talked about Hillary Rodham Clinton's new book, What Happened. Jill, thanks again.
Thanks so much.
Alexandra Alter joins us now with lots of news from the literary world. Hi, Alexandra.
Hi, Pamela. Yes, this week there was a just crush of news from literary award season, which is definitely upon us now this week. We had the long list for the National Book Award. which are always interesting indicators of sort of what the best books of the year are shaping up to be or what the most talked about books of the year are shaping up to be. And along with that, we had the shortlist for the Man Booker Prize.
Let's start with the Brits.
Let's start with the Brits, who are getting more and more American. There were 3 Americans.
Yeah, I should say, really. Let's start with the
3 out of 6 finalists were Americans this year, and that prompted the usual grumpiness from people who feel like the prize has lost its character since they opened it up to Americans. And essentially any book that's published in English in England is now eligible.
So it used to just be the UK, Zimbabwe, Canada, Australia. Was New Zealand allowed in?
It was the Commonwealth, yes, and Zimbabwe, Ireland, and Britain.
Okay.
So that was the original sort of geography of the prize. And since they opened it up to Americans, of course, Paul Beatty won last year for The Sellout. He was the first American to ever win. And this year, there are 3 Americans on the shortlist: George Saunders for his debut novel, and Paul Auster, which is interesting since he's so well established, and then a debut novelist, Emily Fridland.
And that's for History of Wolves.
Exactly.
So who were the people, not to be negative, but who were the surprised people who were caught?
That is always another, area where you get a lot of grumpiness. And there were some really big surprises. A lot of people were surprised to see that Colson Whitehead did not make it from the long list to the short list for the Underground Railroad. And while the judges were emphatic that they're really judging the books, based on the content and picking the best ones, I mean, there might have been a sense that, well, he won the Pulitzer and the National Book Award. Perhaps he's gotten his awards due.
And Oprah, come on.
And
the 10 best books for the New York Times.
I think, that all praise is due, but I think perhaps there might have been a sense that there had been enough critical praise and awards recognition.
And of course, Arundhati Roy.
Arundhati Roy was cut. That was her much anticipated second novel, The Ministry of Utmost Happiness. And of course, she won for her debut novel, so that would have been kind of a neat trick to pull off to win for your second novel. That's fairly unusual. Hilary Mantel has pulled it off, but there aren't that many double Booker winners. Mm-hmm. I think Peter Carey might be another one. So people were surprised to see those 2 books fall off, as well as Zadie Smith's Swing Time, because that did get a lot of critical love. So for the non-Americans on the list, Mohsin Hamid made the short list for Exit West, which was his, novel that sort of has a fantastical premise of these magical doors that can ferry people around the globe, but it really was a very realist look at the plight of refugees and immigrants and the sort of nationalist backlash that we've seen in the West. So it was a very timely book, and it did receive a lot of praise when it came out here as well as in Britain. And the British writer Fiona Mosley made the shortlist for her debut novel, Elmet. And the other Brit on the list is Ali Smith for Autumn, which has been called the first great novel about Brexit that sort of takes on that theme.
And that's the first in a quartet.
Exactly. So that'll be interesting to see who emerges as the winner. The winner will be announced on October 17th.
Has anyone done the Karl Ove Knausgaard Autumn versus Ali Smith Autumn thing? Who's going to win the seasons?
Yes. More of the
who wins the
seasons.
fall, and then maybe one of them will win the winter.
That would be
we'll kind of do a tally as we go along.
Yes.
All right, let's talk about the National Book Awards long lists.
Yes. So that was unveiled slowly during the week across 4 categories: young people's literature, poetry, nonfiction, and fiction. And they often save the fiction for last.
Can we start with the fiction?
That's sort of splashiest. Yes, let's start with the fiction. Like the Booker, they really paid a lot of attention to debut novels this year. There were 3 debut novels on the long list for the National Book Awards. One was The Leavers by Lisa Coe. Another one is Carol Zoroff's Barren Island. And another one is Margaret Wilkerson Sexton's novel, A Kind of Freedom.
Yeah, the Margaret Sexton we just reviewed in the book review, and that's a sort of a 3-generation family saga set in New Orleans and Louisiana. And I think there might be a Hurricane Katrina element to that.
Yes. And Lisa Coe's novel, The Leavers, was kind of a favorite among indie booksellers over the summer. I saw a lot of people recommending it.
All right. What about among the old-timer novelists?
Old-timers, we have Jasmine Ward's Sing Unburied Sing, which has gotten incredible critical praise and a lot of love from the bookselling community as well. We also have Jennifer Egan for her new novel, Manhattan Beach. This was a much anticipated follow-up to A Visit from the Goon Squad, and people have been waiting years and years for this novel. This is very different. It's historical fiction set in New York, but that made the long list. Daniel Alarcon was nominated for his short story collection, The King is Always Above the People. And Elliot Ackerman's novel, Dark at the Crossing, was also nominated.
That's his second novel.
Yes, that's right. His novel, Dark at the Crossing, is about an Arab-American man who is attempting to get into Syria, and he's dealing with loss and grief as he's searching for a cause.
All right. Let's go quickly to nonfiction, poetry, and why. But let's start with the nonfiction.
Yes, the nonfiction list looked interesting this year. Again, it's kind of like it was last year. It's very political. A lot of works about social issues made the list. So some notable names on there include Masha Gessen, who was nominated for The Future is History, How Totalitarianism Reclaimed Russia.
That book is not out yet.
It's not out yet, and its early reviews have been very positive. Of course, it's very topical with all the interest in Russia right now. Another unsurprising name on the list is David Grann, the New Yorker writer. He was nominated for Killers of the Flower Moon, The Osage Murders, and The Birth of the FBI, which is a Doubleday book, and again, got incredible reviews. Also on the list is Naomi Klein for No Is Not Enough, Resisting Trump's Shock Politics and Winning the World We Need, and Nancy MacLean's Democracy in Chains, The Deep History of the Radical Right's Stealth Plan for America. So you can see a lot of the resistance sort of theme in
And
this
she was a
list.
podcast guest a few weeks ago.
Oh, that's right. Kevin Young is also nominated. Of course, he was been nominated before for poetry, but this time he's nominated in nonfiction for his forthcoming work, Bunk, The Rise of Hoaxes, Humbug, Plagiarists, Phonies, Post-Facts, and Fake News. Another kind of timely political-themed book that's on the list.
For poetry, also an interesting, really diverse list. Frank Bedard, Chen Chen, Leslie Harrison, Marie Howe, Lily Long Soldier, Sherrod Santos, Danez Smith, among others. So that's an exciting list for poetry.
And I think some debut collections there as well. They really seem to be looking for new voices this year.
All right, quickly, let's talk about books for kids.
Yes, and this is often my
list?
favorite category. And there were some books I was really excited about this year, particularly Angie Thomas, the author of The Hate You Give. Which
you profiled her.
I profiled her. I love the book, and it was, on the top of the New York Times bestseller list, and it deals with police violence, which is an issue that she's really passionate about. And I think she's gotten a lot of love from the book-selling community and from the YA community. Also, Jason Reynolds, he's nominated for Long Way Down.
Mm-hmm.
Another exciting name on the list is Erica L. Sanchez. Her novel is I'm Not Your Perfect Mexican Daughter, and she's better known for her poetry at this point. Also, Samantha Mabry for All the Wind in the World. And Ibi Zoboi is also nominated for American Street.
Excellent.
So it's, again, a diverse and interesting list of writers there.
All right. Well, we won't have the winners for a while,
That's
but we will
true.
have more short lists and long lists, I think, in the interim.
Oh, and of course the Nobel we have coming too. So there'll be plenty of more news. The finalists for the National Book Award are going to be announced on October 4th. And then, of course, the big gala is on November 15th when we find out the winners.
Where Alexandra will be reporting hard at work while
That's right.
drinking cocktails. All right. Thanks, Alexandra.
Thanks for having me.
My colleagues Greg Coles, John Williams, and Jen Salai join us now to talk about what we're reading. Hi, guys.
Hi, Pamela.
Let's talk about Jen's book, which it looks like an old library book that you've got there, or like something that you found on your parents' bookshelf.
Well, the book is Simple Justice by Richard Kluger, and it's a book that I think this is the 2004 edition, so it was released because of the 50th anniversary of Brown v. Board. And I got a copy at my old workplace, and I kept meaning to read it. And then finally, this weekend, there was an issue of the New York Times Magazine about education, and a really great story by Nicole Hannah-Jones about resegregation in Jefferson County in Alabama. And so I decided now was time to
It's so
read this book.
interesting.
I mean, this book is about 900 pages, so I'm about maybe 70 or 80 pages in. And so he starts off with essentially the history of slavery and the Civil War. And also now I'm on a chapter about the history of the Supreme Court.
And
so
this is a book just about segregation in education, or specifically about Brown versus Board?
It's everything that led up to Brown v. Board.
Okay.
And so it's very, very detailed. And so, as I mentioned, there's a chapter on the history of slavery in the United States, as well as the Civil War, then moving through Reconstruction, the role of the Supreme Court, the role of federal troops in the South. So I'm right at the beginning.
Between the length of it and the cover, it does look like something you would be assigned to read in law school or something. It's giving me flashbacks. Not that I went to law school. It's just giving me flashbacks to required reading.
Yes. I mean, I will say that he tries to write it in a more sort of novelistic way, which sometimes means that some of the language is maybe a little bit too florid in some parts, but I mean, it doesn't read as sort of a dry,
Well, I was going to say,
history.
too florid isn't what, like, it doesn't give the impression that would be the problem.
I know. Well, you know what? Here, we're being
good.
very unfair to our podcast listeners because they're not looking at this book.
Right.
And I think we are truly judging this book by its cover, which just has like one of those, I guess, did it come out in 2004 or was it reissued in 2004?
So originally, I think it was it was published in 1976.
Got it. So it's got a 1976 kind of
very.
cover on it.
I'm going to take a picture of it and put it on Twitter after we post the podcast.
All right.
so
That's the
people
only
can
fair
judge
thing
for
to do.
themselves.
Who's Richard Kluger, the author?
So he was a longtime journalist, and then eventually he started writing books. And I read a book, I think in the 90s, that he wrote about the history of the cigarette industry called Ashes to Ashes.
Okay. More assigned reading, John?
No, I'm so not in school anymore, and blessedly so. I'm finishing Barbara Comans' book, which I mentioned last week, but I haven't finished yet, so I'll bring it up again next week when I have a firm final opinion. What I've done in the meantime is I picked up, I'm not sure why exactly. I always buy books, which is so insane given
That's
how many
so
I have.
insane.
It's really crazy how many I have unread at home.
But we all do that, right? Do you buy books too?
Oh, absolutely.
And do you buy books, Jen?
Sometimes.
Oh, well, I mean,
I
get, obviously, like anything new I can get, but I buy old books all the time.
Me
which
too.
Is,
Yeah, it's terrible. It's
I
troubling.
buy new books.
Well, we're supporting
It's troubling at tax time when you look and you see the totals.
I know, because writing things off doesn't, well, anyway, that's a whole other conversation.
In future, we will talk about book buying and taxes. And
The
yes,
podcast. Get a lot of listeners for that one.
actually, I'm interested. But anyway, others probably are not.
I was meeting a friend, and I was in the neighborhood early, and I went to there's this great bookstore in New York called 192 Books on 10th Avenue, which is, a very small and well-curated store. And I just for some reason picked up Rachel Cusk's 2012 memoir, Aftermath. The subtitle is On Marriage and Separation.
This is like known, I think, among readers as like the divorce book.
The divorce book. And it's funny because I'm about 40 pages into it, and she's obviously increasingly well-known in the States. She's a British writer, and she's increasingly well-known for her sort of series. There are 2 of 3 have been released already that are kind of slightly autobiographical, but also very elliptical and novels based on her life. Where those books are very subtle, and I love them, this book is much more emo. It's like she much more strenuously poetic, but also strenuously emotional and personal. And she's talking about divorcing her husband and what happened with their children and the custody of them after that, but also just about what it meant for her to grow up with her mother and her vision of what it meant to be a woman and the feminine role in a marriage and the masculine role in a marriage and every, where we've come to as a society with those things. She says at one point, I felt beneath the reconfigured surface of things the tension of the old orthodoxies. And that kind of sums up a lot of her, what she's getting at in terms of how we deal with sort of modern arrangements and how these very ancient, social expectations kind of keep erupting out of them. But it's incredibly well written. And it's funny that it wasn't that long before these novels that she's recently written that she published this, because it is she's equally a good writer in both, but the feeling and the tone of them is very different.
I'm curious, did you read Elena Ferrante's Days of Abandonment?
I did. I love that book.
And also kind of much angrier than the...
Yes, and then the novels, became
The
like
subgenre is the
Neapolitan.
angry divorce book.
Yeah, exactly. Days of Abandonment, again, a divorce, separation, affair book.
I
No,
think
and
that was
very
the
raw.
angriest
And
book that I've
very
ever
emotional,
read.
very angry, and
Yes.
Such a
Other
great
than
book.
maybe Wave, the Sonali Dharaniagala book. Was
also
another book.
very fast, as I think Aftermath is.
Yes.
It's a very short book and just kind of distilled, kind of raw, in a way that Ferrante's subsequent Neapolitan novels were not. They're much broader in scope, much more kind of intellectualized. So it seems a little bit like Cusk and Ferrante are following this similar path there. Like they just poured everything out then and then kind of stepped back.
A year ago, I would have been tempted to say that maybe Cusk is Ferrante, but I think we.
I hope not, because Cusk has reviewed Ferrante for us.
Self-dealing.
To return to a superficial note, the jacket cover on that actually is quite good. A broken dinner plate.
Yeah,
I
it's
have to say.
very. It's a white dinner plate with two cracks in it against a very stark black background. It's
When
very
that
simple
book
but effective.
came out, readers, there are people who love Cusk, and I think we were probably in that camp here, most of us at least, if not all. But she also makes people really angry. Like, there was a very upset reaction, I think, especially in the UK, where she's from, to that book.
Yes.
There are also more
Why was
gossipy
that,
reactions to her.
I'm not sure because I actually haven't read Aftermath, but just from my understanding, just the sort of objection from what I recall at the time was just her treatment of the marriage just
The
felt
husband.
unfair
Also,
to people.
she was really attacked, I think, as a mother.
She was attacked for a life's work, too,
Yeah.
which I think
That was
is
a previous book
fantastic
about
I
motherhood.
love that
mean,
book.
that's
I can't
such a
even. I
good
can't
book.
understand the attacks to that book. I get
Yeah.
angry at the anger.
Agreed.
at that
Agreed.
book.
But I think in both cases, I think A Life's Work, which is about a very conflicted view of motherhood and coming to grips with that, and then this book, which is also deals a lot with family arrangements, and I just think they're very hot button issues for people in terms of how they've arranged their own lives, and people get very defensive about her very strong opinions about things.
And I also think that there's a way in which, especially with A Life's Work, the motherhood is such a sentimentalized topic that I just think her very unsentimental look at what it is to become a parent was, just condemned at the time. But that is a great book. I'm thinking maybe I should reread it.
This sort of gets at how raw she is about it. She talks about how pregnancy and motherhood have, as she puts it, are these ancient ebbs and flows in her, the dark ages on which I now feel the civilization of our family has been built. And she says that it was a condition of the treaty that gave me my equality that I would not invoke the primitivism of the mother, her innate superiority, that voodoo in the face of which the mechanism of equal rights breaks down. And that's the kind of, it's just it's not politicized, but it easily gets there. If you want to have those arguments, she's giving you that.
It is fairly politicized, yeah.
So, Greg, what are you reading this week?
I'm continuing on this kick I've been on slightly recently of kind of getting away from the domestic, certainly of the American. I'm reading a nonfiction book, but following up on the Italo Calvino, Baron in the Trees, and then Lily King's Euphoria, which is about anthropologists in New Guinea. I'm now reading Susie Hansen's new book. It was on our cover a couple of weeks ago.
And she was on the podcast.
Notes on a Foreign Country. People who heard her on the podcast or read the review will know that Susie Hansen is an American journalist who has been living in Turkey since, I think, 2007 when she got a grant to go there. And the grant was initially premised on the idea that she would be studying the treatment of the Armenian genocide in Turkey. And then as she got there were other people working on that subject, and she kind of got more interested just in what it was to be an American living in a predominantly Muslim country after 9/11, and what it was to be an American living in the age of American empire that isn't discussed so much, American empire. And so that becomes the subject of the book more than the Armenian genocide. I read a book a couple of years ago by another young American journalist named Malin Toumani, I think it was. The name of that book was There Was and There Was Not, which comes from a Turkish saying. Toumani is an Armenian American who went to go live in Turkey specifically to grapple with this question of the genocide. And I lived for a time near Glendale, California, which has, I think, the country's largest concentration of Armenian Americans. And my family is friends with some Armenian Americans here. And so the question of the genocide and Turkey's treatment of it, refusal to acknowledge it, has always been an interesting question to me. So that's the reason I initially picked up this book. But Susie Hansen pivots very interestingly from this question of one country, Turkey, refusing to acknowledge its role, its historical role in its treatment of a group there, to another country, America, and its refusal to acknowledge the implications of its own political behavior. And so it becomes kind of a meditation on American innocence, willful American innocence. I'm about 60 pages in right now. It's a little bit of a travelogue, a little bit of a political meditation. It's moving right along. Pamela, what are you reading?
All right. This is my show-offy week, so I've been reading 4 books, but they're short books.
You weren't even on vacation.
I wasn't even on vacation. They
working
were
hard.
really,
We
really
see you.
short books. I finished 2. I'm in the middle of 2 other ones. But what I want to talk about is sort of how you come to read a book, because I read them all for very different reasons, but recurrent reasons, like reasons that I often will come to read a book. The first book that I read because I'd read so much about it. And finally, I got to the point where I was like, I just got to read the book itself. And that's Mark Lilla's new book, The Once and Future Liberal, which is a very short book. And it is based on an op-ed that he wrote for the New York Times last year. So he turned this around very quickly. And it's about the election results and about identity politics, both in terms of the kind of larger American culture and specifically on campus. Lilla is a professor of the humanities at Columbia University. And I had read that op-ed, and I then read Ta-Nehisi Coates' essay that deals with many things, but talks about this in The Atlantic. And I had read a conversation that Lilla had with David Remnick. And I read all of these things around the book. And I finally was like, if I'm going to try to figure out, what I think of this and have some kind of informed opinion, I'm going to have to read the book itself, damn it.
The things you read about the book are like 5 times as long as the book is tiny.
The book is tiny. I know, it really didn't. So that I'm not showing off that I've been reading so many books, because they are really relatively short and quick and easy reads. Well, Lilla's not an easy read, but it's a very accessible book. And I think it's obviously a controversial one. He is writing about kind of why he thinks that the left, liberals, Democrats, have lost their way electorally, and the role that he thinks a focus on identity politics plays in that loss. And I think that whether you agree with it or not, I certainly found a lot of it persuasive. I think it's important to kind of read those books just to step away from kind of all of the hot takes that you might see on social media, and to kind of get at the argument and understand the core of it. So that was one book. And it is a quick and short, very fast book to read. And then the next book I read, the reason I read this book was something that happens, I think, probably happens to all of us. It was kind of like a little bit of a guilt read. I went to a book party last week for another writer, and it was hosted by Katy Martin, who has written many books. And she greeted me with like, oh my God, look. And there in her bedroom was a book that I had written, and she quoted from it. She was clearly reading it, and she quoted from a part where I'm in Paris. And she was like, have you read my book, Paris, a Love Story? And I just, instantly felt terrible. And I was like, no, I haven't read it, but I do have it. I do plan to read it. And I went home to read it. And as I was going to bed, I was texting with a friend who's also an author. And I said, listen, I can't really text. I'm going to bed to read. And she said, what are you reading? And I said, well, I'm reading this book by Katy Martin, Paris, a Love Story. What are you reading? And she said, oh, I have to read so-and-so's book because I just saw her and she told me how much she loved my book. And I said, I loved your book too, but I hadn't actually read it. So we both, immediately stopped texting and went off to do our guilt reads. But I will say...
At least you had told the truth.
But this was, not a guilty pleasure. It really is a true pleasure. Katy Martin is a journalist and writer. She's working on a book about Angela Merkel now, and she's written a number of books. And this is a personal book. It's a memoir of her experiences in Paris, first as a student. She is the daughter of 2 Hungarian journalists who were imprisoned for their work and eventually made their way to America. So she first returns to Europe as a student to Paris. And then she was married to Peter Jennings, the former ABC News anchor, and they worked together in Paris for a time. And then, of course, she was married to the late Richard, actually both of them now dead, Richard Holbrooke, former diplomat. And it's really just a totally absorbing story. And it is a love story, especially 2 very different love stories, or 3 really 4 different love stories. It's a love story. It's 3. It's a love story with Paris. It's her love story with Peter Jennings, which was a very turbulent marriage that ended in divorce. And then it was her love story with Richard Holbrooke. And it's just kind of a lovely book. So I really enjoyed that. And then getting to number 3, I have been reading Katy Tour's memoir, Unbelievable, which I talked about earlier with Jill Abramson. And that really is a very quick read. I think I read, like 90 pages on the train this morning. But one of the things that strikes me most about her book, this is the memoir of being on the campaign trail covering Donald Trump, is it really brings you back to the moment when all of these kind of things happened for the first time, and it allows you to re-experience the shock of it, the shock of his first sort of attacks on Muslims, the shock of the way that he spoke about journalists, the shock of his language and the kind of intemperance of it. And so it's not a pleasant book to read because it's like really reliving those moments. Yeah. Maybe it'll be cathartic in the end, but I'm not there yet. And then the last book, I'm often very much in the mood for Le Carré. I decided I was in the mood for John Le Carré, and I came to it because in her book, Katy Martin talks about Le Carré's book, A Small Town in Germany, which is about Bonn, which is where she was assigned when she was a TV journalist. And so I took out, I have a bunch of Le Carrés at home, and I kind of spread them out, and I was like reading the backs, like which one am I in the mood for? And I read the backs of all of them, and I landed on A Perfect Spy. I'm like, this is the one I'm in the mood for. When I picked it up, I noticed that there was already a bookmark in it. So I'd already been in the mood for this book. I'd already started it. And then I guess I stopped being in the mood for it. I couldn't remember why I put it down, but I had. And now I'm starting it anew. And I have to say, I really do think I'm in the mood for this. So unfortunately for our listeners, this will probably be my book for the next 6 weeks because it's almost
power broker.
Yeah, it's almost 600 pages
no,
long.
you'll fight for it. It's a spy story.
But John Le Carré, he's he's an excellent writer. They're complicated stories. I actually move relatively slowly through them because I feel like I need character charts and he often also leads me to sort of the internet to figure out to remember what was going on where because they're historical. So that's it. That's it for me.
All right. Well, we'll get an update next week.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Pamela.
Thanks, Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. Inside the New York Times Book Review is produced by Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.